Hello everyone, and welcome to this latest instalment in our series Polishing the Classics, a series in which we look at classic endgames together with our engines and discover amazing new plans, ideas, details and defensive resources. I'm Grandmaster Matthew Sadler, and we are taking a look today at the game between ex-world champion Boris Spassky, whose birthday it is today, happy birthday Boris, and Carlos Guimard. It was played at the Capablanca Memorial, Havana, 1962. What we're going to see in this game, it looks very much like a very smooth win by a stronger opponent. But as the engines show, Black had considerable defensive resources, and there are some amazing things that have gone completely undiscovered until now. I mean, this is a fairly typical IQP position, and maybe conditioned by Nimzovich's evocative descriptions of the perils of an isolated queen's pawn and the power of the blockading knight on d4. We often instinctively assess such structures as just much better for white. In fact, without the rooks on, the engines assess these positions as completely equal, 0.00. And after all, the d5 pawn can't be attacked with any sort of overwhelming force, and it actually performs a very useful role of holding back the advance of the central and kingside pawns. And in fact, Black's king only really needs to reach d6 once the rooks are exchanged, and every single entry point that white has is controlled. However, in these sort of positions, extra pieces can make a difference. And here, of course, the major pieces are very important, especially considering the difference in quality between white's rook and black's rook. White's rook dominates the open c file. It's got invasion squares on c7 and c8, and black's rook is just looking at a pawn that doesn't need any defense. So it's clear here that that white has got a fairly substantial initiative. And what is white going to aim for? Well, we've already mentioned it. Rook to c7 is one idea. Also, rook to c8 as well is quite powerful. The rook controls the c file and can also step off to b8 to attack the b7 pawn. And of course, you can also imagine some ideas where white's going to gain space, either with the on the king side, maybe with g4, h4, maybe with a pawn break, b4, b5, and the king could also come in there. For example, king g3, f4. So, my initial reaction when I saw this position was, I guess this is just very good for white. But my engines certainly didn't think so. And, in this position, Guimard played the move rook d7, which is kind of a little bit submissive, really. It stops rook c7, but it allows rook c8. My engines, and well, you can understand why, they decided that it was perfectly possible for black to fight white's rook when it enters into the position, because after all, as we've seen, the exchange of rooks is absolutely fine for black. So my engines actually just wanted to play the move king f8. Very logical. Rook c8 check is what we're going to look at. Actually, neither Stockfish nor Koivisto 7.13 in the games that I played even bothered with rook c8. They were just playing the move b4, just trying to get in b4, b5, develop a little bit more elbow room on the queen side. So that sort of shows, right? But after rook c8, we play king e7. And we're just threatening rook d8, and rook c7 can be met by rook d7. So, no problems there. So rook b8, rook d7, b4, rook c7. Black takes control of the open file there, and also prepares this nice move, knight d7, chasing the rook away from b8. It's beautiful how the king, rook and knight are coordinated, and you'll notice, black's paying no attention to the d5 pawn. The d5 pawn is, holding back the white e pawn, stopping white from gaining space like that very nicely. And well, we're just trying to play around it really. And of course, the knight on d4, great blockading square, but it's not attacking the pawn on d5, so there's no need to defend it. Now things, are still not easy. After rook h8, king f6 is quite important to meet rook h6 with king g7. And if g5, rook c4, I thought maybe there was the clever idea, rook h4, and if rook b4, then knight f5 check. But black just plays king g8, gets out of that check, and well, this rook has got a few problems, and we're attacking the queen side. So, after king f6, well, my engines were playing rook d8, king e7, rook h8, king f6. And rook d8, king e7, rook a8, rook c4, b5. I mean, white, maintains some sort of initiative, but black is doing absolutely fine, and my engines were holding these positions without any problems at all. Simply the rooks are active. This rook is dangerous, but it's not really, causing these to become less passive. And the black rook is free to attack. So, good chances for a draw there for black. So that was really, a very big moment actually, but all based around the idea of properly assessing, a king and knight versus king and knight position. And if you know that those are equal, then you're not going to be at all scared about offering an exchange of rooks. So after rook d7, white played rook c8, and now the evaluation jumps from plus 0.2 or 0.3 to plus 1.7. So the engines really think that white has got a massive advantage here. Actually, in the next few moves, Guimard takes some, pretty unusual decisions, but some pretty good ones as well. Certainly not decisions that I would, naturally have found. So, puts up a good resistance now. What Guimard does, Guimard plays knight g8. We'll just have a little look at what Carsten Müller suggested here. And that was knight h7, and he was suggesting that black should play knight g5 to e6 or knight f8 to e6 and fight against this this knight on d4. Now, fighting against this knight on d4 is a decent idea in principle, because this knight covers everything. So if you get rid of this knight and if this rook gets active, it's actually got targets to attack. That's great so far. The only problem is that the way that this is happening, and just showing a typical continuation that you saw in my engine games, is that black is going to get this this rook ending, get rid of this knight, but it's not going to get control of the c-file. So there's not going to be any activity for black to exploit. You're going to get rid of this knight, but it's not going to do you much good. And in the meantime, white's brought the king over to d3. It's covering lots of entry squares. Lots of weak pawns are protected, and basically white is going to move and change and chop around things at its own leisure. And my engines were at +4, +5 already, in this position, just like trivial. So after knight e6 played here, a couple of moves. If king e6, then there's a couple of ideas. g4 was one idea. Just intended to go rook h8 and pick up the pawn. This was a very nice idea from Dragon, played against Komodo. Just whack, in we go. Let's just grab the pawn on b7 and have our fun here. King c5, rook d5, rook d7. We take, and then we go b5 afterwards, and the pawn queens. Just very, very powerful there. F takes c6 is a better move. But my engines were again sort of causing unpleasantness on the king's side. These pawns are very difficult to defend. It's after king e7, king e2, king f6, h5, takes rook d8, e4, f4. These are not very easy things to see, but simply all the time the black pawns end up being more vulnerable than white's pawns. For example, what do we get here? King d2, d4. This was a line that I saw repeated many times. Rook takes b7, and these two central connected passed pawns are going to be killers. So not easy in any way, but I think the idea of challenging the knight on d4 is good, but we need to achieve more with our rooks, right? I think we need to be much more active than this in order to stand any chance of finding drawing chances. So what Guimard does, I think, is very clever, right? He plays knight g8, and the idea here is to play the knight to e7, and then you're giving white a little bit of a decision. That rook on c8, if it retreats back, then actually black's managed to evict the white rook with relatively little pain. The knight now covers c8, and the rook now covers c7, so white's never going to invade the 8th rank again in the short term. And if the rook goes to b8, it steps off the c-file, and we can move our rook to c7. And then, well, we can think of all sorts of things. I mean, there's all sorts of regroupings we could think with a knight, maybe knight c8, round to d6, for example. Or we could, we freed f6 for the king, so we could bring the king over. All sorts of ideas, but at least you're not leaving the rook on c8. You're not allowing white to maintain all of its advantages. You're saying, okay, well, move the rook over to b8, and I'll take the c file, and maybe I can do something with that. So that's a very, very nice defensive plan here. And actually, the next thing shocked me completely. The next move that Guimard played, but it's definitely the engine choice, and again. It's definitely got very good points there. I mean, I was expecting something like rook c7, and now king e2, knight c8. This was what I was expecting. King d3, I go king f6, and after h4, I go knight d6, something like that. And, I've got this knight nice and active. It's holding b7, so that should free the rook to do something a little bit active. My king's sort of, maybe coming here to defend an h-pawn if necessary, maybe coming here to defend a knight. All possible, really. Now, it wasn't enough for against my engines. I mean, but this was an incredibly intricate endgame. For the engines, of course, it's trivial. But, this was basically, not at all obvious to me quite what was happening here. White's feinting on one side, black's reacting, and then white's feinting back on another. And, essentially what happens here is that white's got a passed a-pawn. This h6 pawn is very weak, and these pawns are quite attackable by the king. So it's a difficult rook ending for black, and, this ended up being a win in double quick time, really, for white. But king d6, f4, and the pawns start to roll, and we've got rook f6 to h6 as well. But still, it felt like quite complicated somehow, and definitely some chances. So that was what I was expecting here. Rook c7, knight c8. What Guimard did was play h5, and my first reaction there was yuck. What on earth is that? That's panic. But it's not really. The first idea that black has is, if I can play hg, then great. That's one less target for white to attack on the king's side. When the king's moving away, rook h8 to attack the pawn on h6 was quite nasty. So, absolutely great. Now, of course, white is going to play g takes h5, and create this weak pawn. And, in some ways it feels very bad to just for free, for nothing, just to give a weakness on h5. But you look at what black achieves like this. I mean, black weakens the f5 square, of course. It looks weaker than it was before. But actually, it's much more accessible to black now. I mean, here there was a pawn on g4, stopping the knight coming to f5. And now if I bring my king here and my knight out, then I can challenge the knight on d4 in that way. Moreover, I've actually also got the g6 square for the knight as well. So actually like this, I've gained 2 squares for the knight. So dynamically, that's actually been really helpful, even if I've got a static weakness on h5. And that static weakness on h5, though, is not actually just a helpless one, because there is actually the idea of playing h4 in this position, and that stops the king coming out to g3, which might make a future rook c7 to c2 a little bit irritating. And, if I play my pawn to h4, it fixes this one as a weakness. So, again, you can imagine a rook coming into maybe c1 to h1 to attack it. So, I mean, it's a really interesting idea, and actually it required some very, very good play here from Spassky. And actually, Spassky was kind of not up to the challenge here, because in this position, Spassky made actually a total misstep, and yet it's a very, very natural one, because Spassky played the move king g3 here, it feels so natural, right? Black's weakened himself in this area, so we bring the king in. And, the game continued, knight g6, f4, king f6. Now a very strange move from Spassky, f5, which should have been met by the move knight e5, after which black has actually good chances. The engines don't think that black's worse anymore. It was a very strange thing, really, to just to give the e5 square to the knight. But actually, Guimard played knight e7, which makes you think, yeah, maybe there was just something, that I can't quite grasp yet, but something that, in the heat of battle that looked rather scary about knight e5. But here, black got horribly crushed. Just ended up going backwards all the time. f6, that's a very nice move. Knight f6, knight f5 wins a piece. And then after b4, h4, knight b3. Oh, lovely from Spassky there. Beautiful vision, right? I mean, you play this move b4 with the idea of playing knight b3 and knight c5, winning the pawn. Rook d6, rook b7, knight d4, and Spassky was in complete control and won in a few more moves. However, after this move, king g3, my engine evals were, went down, and not just down, they just went down to 0.0. This is just equal now, and which seemed quite amazing to me. And it's not like easy equal. I'll say that straight away. But it really does seem to be equal. And I'll show you two key lines here. So instead of knight g6, playing the move rook c7. Now, obviously this is a good general move. It's what we want to do. We've chased the rook away, so the rook's coming to c7. But it's kind of more than that, really. And when you start to look at it, you suddenly realise what White's doing wrong, because this rook is here it's can come into c3, for example, and now it's attacking the e3 pawn, which is no longer defended by the white king. So already we've got, a weakness to attack that wasn't there before. And then if we go king f4 with white, which looks quite powerful, also defends the pawn on e3, then black's playing king f6. And, we're always talking about, your king needs to be involved. We've been looking at this, talking about this an awful lot in the previous examples of polishing the classics. I'd really recommend, looking at those the game Spassky-Ivanovich, Smyslov, Konstantinopolsky, Capablanca, Ragozin. Really a lot about that, about paths for the king. And what you see here is that the white king has just simply run into a blocked path. And it's not only that he can't get further anymore. There's going to be a few awkward things. We've got checks, and we could follow up with a check, and we could even maybe just go rook c3 and then check the king away, and then e3 is going to fall. It's not just that the king, we'll just move back and it'll be fine. It's just like a real problem now for white. How is the game continuing? h4 was being played by my engines just to stop black from going knight g6 and h4 check. But then knight g6, king g3. Now you're protecting the pawn on h4, and your king's tied down to it. King e5. And the king's beautifully active. And what can we do? We can go rook e7, we can go rook c3. We've got all sorts of ideas, or we can just stay still and ask white, what are you going to do? Now, in my engine games here, who was this? This was both, Stockfish Koivisto and Koivisto Stockfish. We were just playing around a little bit. And then finally, in we go. Knight takes h4, rook g5, rook h5, knight g6. And, white's still pressing. This would still be awkward to play against Magnus in a rapid match, but you can clearly see that things have really improved for black. Active rook, lots of pawns on the king side exchange, king active, helping to defend the queen side. And it's simply that white's gone down a rabbit hole, really. Try to force the king through a path that doesn't exist, and that's just given black loads of time to activate himself. Thanks to this this very concrete move h5, accepting weaknesses, but giving the knight lots of extra possibilities. And then there's another hugely important point to this, because, for example, you might say, okay, well, just play f4, for example. We'll take some squares away from the pieces. I might go king h4 later, or I might just bring my king back, no worries. But here, black's got a really important resource. And, we mentioned knight c6. It's quite a key idea. Of course, we're challenging that knight on d4, giving our rook extra invasion points. But, you can think, well, knight c6, that's not really that great, is it? If I take with a rook on c6, I just go rook b7, and, I'm not quite sure what you're attacking. And after b takes c6, I go rook b6 and pick up the a6 pawn, What are you talking about, Matthew? Well, I mean, I didn't notice this either, but of course my engines did. My goodness, this is Stockfish Koi Visto. Whoops, sorry. C5. That's the move. Rook a6, c4. Yeah, that pawn is a runner. You know, this knight takes c6, b takes c6 has created actually a monster passed pawn supported by the rook on c7. And the fact that the king has moved so far away to the king side means that you can't stop it with the king. You're too far away. So you've got to stop it with your rook. And yeah, again, this is not a... rook ending has got some subtleties, but basically this pawn gets exchanged off for this pawn, and black manages to hold it. I mean, it was often reaching rook and f rook and f and h versus rook endings, which are theoretically drawn. So yeah, I mean, an amazing resource there. You know, just doing what you want, challenging the knight. In a way like the suggestion of Carsten Müller earlier, knight h7 to f8 to e6, but in a much improved version with an active rook, and that's what you really need to make something of it. So, this move king g3 is bad. Well, what were the engines recommending? Well, I didn't understand why at first, or I didn't, it seemed like a natural move, kind of, but, I didn't really understand. But king e2, that's what the engines want to do, just to bring the king to d3. And then, of course, all these knight c6 ideas pushing the c-pawn, they're not going to work because the king's beautifully placed to stop any advancing past c-pawn. And, of course, the king on d3, keeping e3 defended, stopping any rook from invading on c3 or c2, you're just keeping control, basically. That's the point. And well, I mean, we got a lot of had a lot of games like this. Who's this one? This is Stockfish Koi Visto. King g6, king d3, king h7, king c3. Looking to maybe to come in like this and advance. Black plays h4, and then white just sort of turns it around a little bit, interested maybe in winning this h-pawn with maybe a knight f3 or knight f5. Knight e7, rook e8, king g6, b4, king g7, king d3, king h7, rook f8, rook a8, very slow build-up here. King h7, king e2, maybe looking for coming round to here. King g6 played, now rook h8, going for that h-pawn. Rook c7, and now this lovely move, rook d8. And you see this a lot in the engine games and the realization. So they're not getting distracted by taking these pawns. What they're aiming for, actually, is to get the rook over d6 to b6. And then you'll play b5, break it open, get the knight in, and then you'll be able to move in and grab that b7 pawn. But I mean, that's the kind of thing that, why do I think this ending is quite difficult to play for white, to play well? Is that you've got so many ideas where you're feinting on one side, getting a weakness, and then coming back and picking up another advantage that has been released. It's a really high quality technique, this from the engines. Rook d7, so black going for some counterplay, and yeah, this ending turned out to be winning. I'm going to show you the sequence because I just looked at it in amazement. Really, it's of an accuracy that you find hard to feel that you'd be able to reproduce it, but quite nice. I mean, the idea is, first of all, black gets the pawn back, but we manage to chase the king back to the side, and then we win that f6 pawn. However, that h pawn is still quite dangerous, but we've got this move rook g6, so you're offering the exchange of rooks. Obviously, takes. King g4 is going to be fine. We'll take this pawn, come back, defend that one, and then advance it later. So h3 played, and then a gorgeous idea, rook g3. So, just attacking the pawn here. h2 played, of course. Rook takes g2, allows h1 queen. Lovely. But we go rook h3 check, king g7. Now, actually, we've simply got, a beautiful situation here, really, because the rook is active. It's behind the pawn, stopping it from advancing. It's tying the rook down to its defense, and we've got these two pawns. And the beautiful thing about these two connected pawns is it gives the white king an awful lot of cover. And king d6 played now, e4, we're threatening to advance, and now we go round to the side here. Rook b2, b5. I like that move very much. If you go a takes b5, we've got this umbrella effect again. The black pawn here stopping checks, so the white a pawn can run. So rook takes h2 played. Rook takes b5, rook takes h2, rook takes a5, and do you know we have material equality here? It's amazing. But rook h6 check, king f7, rook e6. And yeah, I mean, simply our pawns are much farther forwards. And well, this move necessary to get going. King d6, again exploiting the poor position of this rook on a5. Rook b5, rook e7 check, rook d7. And now we've got the king tied down to the back rank. Our pawns will roll. But look at the black pawn. The black pawn is really going fast, right? But amazingly, yeah, this is just actually just winning here. So check, check, king e8, rook g7, threatening mate. And yeah, if we go king f8, then we've got e7 check. I mean, we're just one move away from queening, right? We've even got lots of checks here. Check, check, king d2. Obviously, black was hoping for king takes b3, b1 queen. But we just sidestep, king d2, and after rook d3, we go king c2. And, well, we've got all the threats in the world, haven't we? We've got king takes b2, we've got rook g8 checkmate. So, yeah, just a total win, basically. Again, you know, quite an amazing rook ending, and I'm not saying necessarily that you could play like that, but yeah, I mean, I think that shows the difficulty of White's task. You know, with this good defense from Black. You know, basically h5, and when you play h5, giving yourself all these extra squares for the knight. Introducing this plan of rook c7, freeing your king. You know, White really needs to work hard to you know, keep control over the black position, and that's really basically heavily involving the king. You know, just stopping entry points, and then yeah, you know, you're gradually going to creep forward and at some stage opportunistically maybe hit the h pawn or something like that. So there we are. I mean, I hope you enjoyed that. I was just shocked, to be honest, playing through this. I mean, first of all, my my initial sort of, you know, lazy, I suppose this is just going to be good for you know, for White, you know, just dismissed really by you know, the engines. Very concrete appraisal. Exchange of rooks is not bad, so yeah, we can afford to fight with the exchange of rooks and challenge a rook that comes in there. And then, you know, afterwards, I sort of looked at what Guimard did, and it sort of looked like panic to me. But actually, it was excellent. You know, really offering these weaknesses in order to free squares for the pieces. And well, I mean, actually, it put a very big load on Spassky, and even Spassky was unable to solve the problem properly, because you know, he went for a very natural thing, something, you know, that you do, I think, you know, intuitively as a matter of course. Opponent makes weakness in an area, you go there. But actually, you know, he just sent his king onto a blocked path, and yeah, just needed a couple of good moves from Black, and yeah, I mean, he would have been very close to equality. And then I like very much, you know, this the better way of playing for White, which is, you know, king e2, king d3, keep control. I'm sure Karpov would have done that. You know, that would have been very natural. I think Spassky, a lot more active player somehow, you know, and really felt the need to get his king involved. Let's, you know, probably thinking kind of some, you know, some attacks against the black king, you know, with the king on f4 here, you know, just maybe we can even run him short of squares, you know. And I have a feeling that a Karpov would have said, oh, okay, we'll just stop what the opponent wants to do and then work out what to do later, you know. But there we are, really advanced technique, you know, and again, you know, I think some beautiful thoughts there again about transposing to pure rook endings. And I found this, you know, this suggestion of Carsten Muller, you know, very interesting. But I also found, you know, the way that the engines were assessing it, simply, you know, but this is just completely won for White, simply because, you know, you've got rid of the knight, that's great for you, but you haven't got any activity. So all of the control that you've destroyed, it's no good if you haven't got the activity to exploit it. And then you compare it to what the engines were showing, in this line after f4, knight c6, takes, and this rook all of a sudden on c7, you've got the activity there, you've got rid of the knight, and now the c pawn runs. It just made great sense, and just sort of the ideas, the sort of correct ideas that that the human players played are just sort of shown very concretely, how to the very best way to implement them. It's a wonderful theme, and I'm never going to forget this now I've seen this game. So there we are. I hope you enjoyed that video. I'm going to do probably a couple of more of these polishing the classics, and then maybe move on to something else. The qualification league has started, so I'm sure there's going to be some exciting stuff there to cover. But if you liked this video, why not give a like or even subscribe to the channel? Keep abreast of all the latest developments, because I do a lot of videos, I have to say, at the moment. And also maybe take a look at the Silicon Road to Chess Improvement, out on Amazon now, available, and chock-a-block full of great engine games, opening, middle game, end game tips, and also lots of very unusual and I think very original ideas about how to train and to work with engines. I'm very proud of that section. Basically everything that I've been doing in the past 10 years and the way that I train with engines. But otherwise, thanks very much for watching this video, and hopefully see you at the next one.